Welcome to Top 10 DBA Mistakes Horror Stories Edition. That's right, we've got monsters and mayhem in all of these different horror story sessions. And today, along with Aaron, Bertrand, and myself, our guest is Argenis Fernandez. Before we jump into the session with Argenis, let me tell you a little bit about the event today. This is presented by SQL Sentry, and we have a lot of good things that you can get for free. Just want to mention off the top of our head that you can get a free copy of our extremely popular tool for query tuning called Plan Explorer. In addition to that, we have 3 ebooks now. Regularly $10 in the Kindle bookstore. You can get any of them or all of them for free if you will drop a note to sales@sqlsentry.com. Aaron is the main editor-in-chief on all of these, so great job, Aaron. Also wanted to mention that this is presented in conjunction with the SQL Cruise. And the SQL Cruise is something that Aaron and I are both happy to be participants in. I am going to be teaching in 2015 on the Caribbean SQL Cruise, and Aaron will be on the Mediterranean SQL Cruise later during the summer. We hope you can join us. It is such a great learning experience. It's wonderful learning and relaxation all at once. So go to sqlcruise.com to find out more details about it. All right, what are we talking about today? Well, this is a panel session with Argenis, and so we are going to cover just a few things here and there on our top 10 list. The top 10 list, in case you haven't seen that separate presentation, goes into a great deal of problems that we see SQL Server DBAs make over and over again. You know, different things that they do that make their life miserable or make it much worse than it could be if they would just manage it a little bit better. And so in that presentation, we point out the different problems and solutions to those problems. Today we're going to tell some horror stories and some war stories about how we've seen these different things happen. Thanks for joining us. We've got a great guest today, Aaron and I. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Kevin. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. I'm glad to be here. Aaron and I have been longtime MVPs, and another member of the Microsoft MVP SQL Server core group is our guest today, Argenis Fernandez. Argenis, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Kevin. Hi, Aaron. I've been around the block for a long time. I'm a SQL Server MVP since July 1st this year, so I'm very happy about that.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. I am also a SQL Server MCM 2008, and now rest in peace, the certification. And yeah, so I basically work for SurveyMonkey as a database engineer, and I do a lot of performance troubleshooting, high availability, disaster recovery, and I think I am what you would call an infrastructure DBA, which is sort of like a weird animal that moves between physical infrastructure of the data center and the actual databases. But you know, along those lines, I also do my occasional bit of coding here and there. So you know, I'm just a weird guy. I do a little bit of everything.
Aside from the DBA work too.
Correct.
Yeah. And you're also very active on Twitter and in social media. So I know I've seen you many times being very helpful on the SQL help hashtag and in discussion forums and things like that.
Yeah, so I'm very much suffering from ADD, so I cannot keep my head looking at one thing at the same time. So I just have to turn my head and look at Twitter, because otherwise I feel bad. And then I look at SQL Help. If anybody jumps in with a question and I happen to know the answer to it, more than happy to provide some assistance there.
You know, one of the things that Aaron and I really look forward to each year is when we participate as lecturers and mentors on the SQL Cruise. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing as a lecturer and a mentor on the upcoming SQL Cruise.
Yeah, so I'm actually very excited about that. This year, in 2014, I attended SQL Cruise as an alumni, and it was just fantastic. I loved participating there. One of the best experiences that we had this year at SQL Cruise was actually with you, Kevin, when we were sitting down with James Steele at dinner, and we were discussing his issues around licensing and all these things. You know, James is a manager of a database development team, of the database administrators as well, and he was having all these licensing issues. So we talked to him, and it looks like from our conversation, he's going to save around something like $50,000, if I
Right.
remember correctly.
That's right. Yep.
So just from sitting down and having dinner with us at SQL Cruise, he was able to pretty much pay for the cruise, right?
And then some.
And then some. That's right. And so that was last year, but this this year, but next year, I'm actually speaking on two different topics. I am doing a talk on SQL Server internals, so like an introduction to SQL Server internals, where I'm going to be talking about the general disk structures, pages, extents, and files and file groups, and
Mm-hmm.
indexes and unclusters indexes and what have you. And then the second talk that I'm going to be doing at SQL Cruise next year is going to be focused on data recovery and corruption and techniques to survive disastrous events on SQL Server. So that one is also going to be very interesting, I think.
Excellent. That sounds like I will be learning a lot when I'm sitting in on those sessions, so looking forward to that. So let's talk about another very common sort of problem that we find DBAs doing. And I think this one might have its origins in the fact that so many people in the database administrative business didn't start there. They didn't intend to become DBAs. Maybe they were assigned that job. Maybe they were the smartest SQL programmer on the Visual Studio team, and they were originally a C# programmer or, something like that. And that was my situation. I was a long-time developer, and I got really good at SQL, and then I got the opportunity to administrate the databases. And so I actually tried to get the job. I applied for a job as a DBA and was able to get one, but I didn't have any training. So I found out that there were all kinds of things that I should have been doing that I wasn't doing before I had a crash. So in my case, one of the things I found out, it had to do with my first article I ever wrote for a SQL Server publication back in 1996 or so. I wrote an article about how I had set up nightly backups. Great idea, right? What I didn't know, and it's still something that SQL Server does today, is it will allow you to back up a corrupt database every day of the week, but it won't allow you to recover one. And so it was at that time that I learned that, wow, you have to do DBCC checks to make sure there's no corruption. I wrote a script that said, hey, if there is corruption, don't even bother going to the next step of backing it up because it's unusable for recovery. Notify, send an email. That was my first lesson in preventative maintenance on SQL Server. I actually wound up having to go back like 2 weeks before I found a version of the database that wasn't corrupt. What kind of thoughts do you have around that?
So, Kevin, I'm actually going to digress on that last statement that you made about backups and stopping the backup when corruption is found. So, one of the things that you should do is run your backups with checksum. So, backup with checksum, what that does is that as it's reading the pages from disk, it'll actually crack open the page and it will calculate the checksum for the page. And if the checksum that's written for that page matches the checksum that you've calculated, there is no corruption on the page. But if there is a discrepancy there, then it will trigger an error. Now, I want to grab a copy of the database even as it is corrupted on disk because things might actually get worse. And I want that backup somewhere else so I can restore it and possibly fix it on the other server should that need to take place. So I want a plan B in all cases here.
Sure.
I don't just stop. I don't back up and I stop there if I found corruption. I want my backup to finish and raise all alerts, all red flags by all means, right? Saying I did find an error in this backup. However, I was able to continue backing up the database as much as I possibly could because I want to salvage those disk blocks. If I have some massive issue, I want those disk blocks saved elsewhere, and so that I can have another copy, maybe for forensic purposes or what have you to deal with. But even beyond that, in this day and age, most large database systems are never going to restore from backup in the event of corruption. You're likely going to fail over to another box. But with that said, if you're using things like database mirroring or in Enterprise Edition and availability groups, which is also an Enterprise Edition feature, you get things like automatic page restores. If you have a corruption on a particular page on disk, you get a nice copy from a secondary or from the primary to secondary. If that needs to be the case, it gets shipped literally across the log stream to the other server. So that's actually very interesting. But by all means, preventative maintenance is something that everybody should do. Database consistency checks, by all means. Run them as frequently as you possibly can. A lot of people forget that if they have been upgrading a database for a really long time, from the SQL 7.0 or 2000 days to 2005, 2008, etc., the page verification options used to be turned pages. So you might have some indexes, some pages on which the checksum might not have been calculated ever since. And I've actually found some of these out in the wild. People don't remember that these things, the defaults used to be very different back in the day.
Well, that shows my age too. Haven't used a lot of those things in quite a while. Another aspect of preventative maintenance too is things like, well, there's more than just the DBCC, check alloc or check table or that sort of thing. There's other DBCC commands that you use for different things, like the check ident, which checks your identity values. Are there other kinds of things that you look for in your environment when you do your preventative maintenance?
And this is not necessarily related to disk structures, but something that we do is plan cache analysis. We look for things that are sort of out of the ordinary on the plan cache. So if we notice that some queries are actually going highly parallel when they're not supposed to be, or queries that have an extremely high cost that have actually been executed throughout a particular period, then we dive into those. But those don't necessarily have to deal with have to be related to backup and restore. There's more of on the fly, what's happening through the system, how can we help it make it better, and how can we make sure that we provide our users with a better experience.
Well, that brings up an interesting discussion too that we could have for those who are listening and maybe haven't worked much with a flash-based system. But one of the big things that I always spent a lot of time worrying about on my SQL servers was how much fragmentation my system was experiencing. If the clustered indexes had a lot of page splits, or maybe the database got shrunk at some point, or a variety of different things could cause logical fragmentation within the data files. So instead of having a nice contiguous set of data, it was scattered all across the data files. And so it's really important to come back and either reorganize or rebuild your indexes, particularly those clustered indexes, so that you would have contiguous data. But when you're on a flash system, it seems like that's not as big of an issue.
Yeah, so actually what's one of the problems that we have right now here at SurveyMonkey, we have a massive table that we haven't reindexed in a really long time. And we're not feeling the fact that that table is highly fragmented because we're running on all flash. So you kind of have to be careful when you run on flash, because it actually tends to mask a lot of issues behind the scenes, like bad queries are they really sneak under the covers because you're not really noticing the effect on storage.
Yeah, you don't have users calling you up complaining about its speed because the flash serves it up so quick.
Exactly.
Another thing too is, as memory gets cheaper and people are building systems with more and more RAM, a lot of times databases are fitting in memory. Not all the time, obviously. Bigger systems are never going to fit in memory because they outpace the increase in capacity and the decline in cost of memory. But a lot more systems today can fit in memory than 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. And so you also get this case where it doesn't really matter to fragment it if everything's in memory already, right? So, and it can actually be quite wasteful to defragment an index that was in memory. So you put it to disk, and then you defragment it, and now it has to get loaded up from the disk again to go back into memory. So
right,
you're actually creating a bigger problem than the fragmentation was causing.
And for those of
however,
you,
we must not forget about the waste of buffer pool space from highly fragmented pages. So I mean, that is actually a problem that I have noticed in quite a number of systems.
yes,
sure, but that is only the fragmentation where a lot of pages are actually empty or close to empty.
Yeah, partially
right.
empty.
So that's not always the scenario. Not all fragmented indexes are because the pages are 10% full or 5% full or something.
And for those who are listening, in case you're not aware of the issue that we're talking about, if you've got spinning rust, as Argenis calls it. You've got these hard disks that have an armature on them, like an old-fashioned record player. You want all the data that's, say, in a clustered index, you want it to be contiguous, side by side, each block next to the next block, so that the armature of the spindle doesn't have to pick up and move to another location and then pick up and move back and pick up where it left off to complete a long read or, say, a range scan or any of those somewhat longer operations. Whereas with a flash SSD subsystem, it doesn't matter if the bits are not contiguous anymore, if they're halfway across that flash array, because with electrons, you're not limited by the speed of an armature moving back and forth. That's a mechanical process that's very, very slow, measured in tenths of a second, whereas with the electrons of a flash subsystem, it's really basically the speed of light. There is a little bit of resistance there, but it's just a tiny bit, so it's basically moving at the speed of electrons and does not care in the least how far apart they are. So as Argenis said, the only real disadvantage you have is if those pages that are no longer contiguous, if they have a high proportion of empty space. So by rebuilding those, you would actually save a lot of space in the DRAM, the actual physical Windows memory that SQL Server gets its hands on. How about index statistics? This is something that we talk a lot about, and those things don't just take care of themselves completely, do they? They need a little bit of help.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. One is the incremental nature. So if you have, in the old days, it was 20% of the table had to change before it would trigger any kind of statistics update. Well, if you have a table with 1 billion rows, you're not getting any changes in your statistics until 200 million rows have changed. They introduced a trace flag that helps take care of that. And they also introduced incremental statistics for partitions in 2014.
I was going to say, I don't know about that one, so that's in the latest release.
It's a fairly new feature, yes.
So tell me about that. Incremental statistics on partitions. So that means if perhaps, I'm guessing, if a partition changes, but the whole overall table hasn't changed over that threshold, but a single partition has, it will readjust the statistics for that one partition?
Right. And it will use the statistics for that partition only when you have partition elimination. So you don't have to worry about any skew from the other partition.
Ah, that is very nice. In fact, I had a question about that at the last conference I spoke at last weekend, so I'm very glad to know that.
They haven't fixed filtered indexes, though. Filtered indexes still have the same problem, where if you have, let's say we have this billion-row table again, and you have a filtered index that only covers 10,000 rows, those statistics are never getting updated unless you do it manually, because 200 million rows are never going to change. Even if you have the trace flag that makes different decisions based on when to update the index, the filtered index is not big enough to ever hit any of the thresholds it's looking at. So you have to continue to maintain filtered index statistics manually.
That's a very interesting tidbit, Aaron.
Yeah, I always learn something in these sessions. Now, one old story I like to tell is kind of funny. Back when the days when index statistics were first introduced, I was talking to the VP, the executive of the SQL Server division, and he told this funny story about how they told, they were telling a major bank about this, and the bank said, this is so important to us that we want to implement this update while it's still in beta, and we want to do it at this particular date. And so Paul Flessner, the VP for SQL Server, said, well, that's a bank holiday, and I'm not coming into the office on the Monday. And the bank said, well, that's why we're doing it on the Monday, because it's a holiday and people won't expect to be banking. And so Flessner said, I won't be there, but my people will. So let me know, if you need any help. I've got a lot of people who are ready to help you get this up and running in production. So he comes in on the Tuesday morning, and the voicemail machines you used to have, the light was flashing, and it was indicating there were a ton of messages on there. And he plays the first message, and it's, hi, this is the CIO at the bank, and performance is terrible. We have no idea what's going on. Every light on every disk is just going like mad. Please call us. And they said, wow, that sounds bad. And he forwards to the next one. It says, hi, this is the bank. It's about midday. Performance is almost normal. Most all the drives are still flashing like mad. We don't have any idea of what's going on. Please call us. And then finally it hits the next fast forward and the final message. Hi, it's the CIO at the bank. It's about 3 p.m. Everything is incredibly fast. We have no idea what's happening. Please call me. And he's like, wow, well, I wonder what that's about. And so they went back and looked at the behavior of what was happening. And at that particular beta release, they had not put in any sort of thresholding on what SQL Server would do when it started to rebuild indexes. Rebuild statistics. And so it took a look at this new big database that had just been filled up with data, and it says, I don't have good statistics on any of these. I'm going to use all of my processing power, all of my I/O power to rebuild all the statistics everywhere all at once. And, so it took half of the morning for that to get through the smaller tables, and then by noon when he called called the second time, it had gotten through all the small tables and maybe some of the medium tables. And finally, by the time he called in 3 p.m, all the index statistics were all refreshed, and it was giving a very good set of execution plans for, all of the queries that were being submitted. So they actually went back.
Kevin, I hope you're not saying that if you have a performance problem, you should just let it be, because it will get better with time.
No, you're right. I'm not saying that. The funny punchline in the story there, and what is not widely publicized anywhere, is that they put a threshold in for how much processing SQL Server will allow to go towards rebuilding index statistics. And the last time I heard a number that I could publicly talk about, SQL Server will devote up to about 7% of system resources towards doing index statistic rebuilds. So if you've ever wondered, this is a huge index, and we've got one table that's 800 times bigger than every other table on there. But SQL Server doesn't seem to get too busy to do, to not service other requests. Why is that? Well, at that time, they added in this little threshold so that SQL Server would only spend up to about 7% of its available resources to rebuild any particular set of index statistics.
Yeah, you can use Resource Governor too to force that if you want it to be lower. For example, you can just set your backup job to run as a user who is in a certain workload group, and then or resource pool, I guess, and whatever they match to with the classifier function, and it can tell SQL Server to only commit this much memory or only commit this much CPU or things like that, just to reduce that. A lot of people do that for their index rebuilds and their index fragmentation jobs.
Any preventative maintenance horror stories, Argenis?
Yes, I do have a very funny one. So it's funny and sad at the same time. So what happened is that I used to work at this company that had literally hundreds of SQL servers in production, and we had to automate a lot of processes there. And I was young and naive, and so it starts the story, right? We had these DBCC check DB jobs that would be scheduled through SQL agents, and they would alert us in case they failed using database mail. Well, like I said, we had hundreds of SQL servers, and in this particular SQL server, database mail wasn't actually configured properly.
Uh-oh.
So, yeah, you can imagine what happened. The DBCC check DB job had been failing for a month before we actually realized that there was corruption in the database. Because a piece of disk went bad, it's magnetic, spinning rust, and, it got corrupted, and then, so it started affecting the other sectors in disk, and eventually got to a table, and eventually got to good data, and so there was a little bit of data loss there, but it wasn't massive, so it wasn't a big problem. So what we changed after that is that instead of letting the servers do the talking through database mail, we would actually inquire the server. So we would, question the servers every so often and ask them, hey, how you doing, through a particular set of scripts. So instead of relying on database mail to do all the alerting there, and it would also brought the benefit that we could do some reporting as well.
I have a very similar story. We had someone that created a job step that would only be reached when the previous step failed. So the problem was they also sent an email when the job succeeded. So they reused the code for success and for failure for this job, and they built the subject, and then they initialized the this job failed variable as a varchar instead of varchar with a length. So they didn't specify the length. So when the job failed in that step, it said declare at failure message varchar is equal to this job failed. So they set up, and so it appended that to the subject. So they set up a rule in Outlook that made this high importance or whatever, and it never tripped the rule because the variable was initialized as a varchar1 because they didn't specify the length. So sometimes they would have an email with the subject that had a T at the end, and sometimes it wouldn't. But they never got a notification that it failed. So then, a couple of weeks later, they're like, "Oh, this job has been failing this whole time." They never knew because they never tested that their lazy shorthand of not specifying the length of the varchar actually truncated the string and didn't build the subject that the rule was implemented. So it's a failure on multiple levels. There are 3 or 4 failures there that led to that, and that's like a perfect storm, and it's hard to do, but it has happened.
Well, and that that all kind of points back to how serious are you about alerting and management of alerts and so forth. Again, one of those nasty defaults is that SQL Server by default will put into the system log every successful backup operation. And that's just the most ridiculous amount of noise. You want your error log to have errors, not anything else. And there is a trace flag. It's 3226 that will turn off.
That's on my checklist. New server configs is to turn those off because they're absolutely useless.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have that in place as well. We back up our transaction log every 5 minutes. So
that fills the log pretty quickly.
It does. And not only that, it also fills the MSDB backup history table as well. So if you're not doing any maintenance on that table grows out of control. And something that I was actually looking at, we had a QA environment that needed to be turned down, and I was working on it yesterday, as a matter of fact. And I dropped this database, right? I'm using the GUI because I'm being lazy. It doesn't really matter how I do it. So I go into the GUI and I start dropping database. And you know how there's this check mark in the GUI that says drop all the history related to backups for the database that you're dropping. So I select that, and I go and start dropping the database, and this thing is taking half an hour to drop the database because it had so many entries on backup history, and the job to actually purge backup history never ran because we had agents disabled in this instance. It was pretty funny. It was a QA instance, so it wasn't a big deal, but I was sitting there for like half an hour just chugging along, and I was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous.
And was this back when that table wasn't indexed? Do you guys remember that? That
No.
actually wasn't that long ago. That table used to not have any indexes on it that would be used for those kinds of operations.
This is true. There was actually a script of MSDB indexes that was fairly popular out there.
Right. Jeff Heitman wrote that.
Yeah, that's right.
That's nuts. I did not realize that.
I forget what version, but Microsoft finally implemented his indexes on those tables, and it made all those jobs work much better.
I think I used those scripts in 2000. I'm not sure that I already needed them in 2005.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. That is one of the things that's great about the SQL community and SQL family is that there are some really, really good scripts that kind of enable us not to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. One of my favorites is from Ola Hallengren. I first wrote about Ola's work when he had first come out with it when I used to write a magazine column about tools for SQL Server magazine back in the day. Do you guys have any others that you follow or like to use a lot?
Oh my God, there's so many good scripts out there, it's not even funny. So besides Ola's, which should be mandatory in my book for everybody, I use NM Mechanics SP Who is Active. That is part of my checklist. On every single server that I roll out, I put on as SP Who is Active. And as a matter of fact, whenever somebody calls me and tells me that there's something going on the server, that's the first thing I will run to figure out what's actually running on the book. Jason Strait has a magnificent set of scripts in his blog, all related to plan cache and also about indexing as well. Fantastic scripts. And if I could recommend some more, there's another great indexing script that Michelle Olford wrote a while ago. I actually like that one over OLS. It's a little bit more customizable in that sense. It's easier to manage. So
I also recommend that one, and you can find those at SQLfool.com. Those are also really, really good scripts as well. You just can't do without Glenn Berry's exceptionally good SQL diagnostic queries as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are fantastic. Those are just great stuff.
Yeah, SQL Skills actually as a whole have a pretty nice little siloed set of things. So Kimberly writes a lot of good scripts about indexes, and Paul writes a lot of good scripts about weights. So he's got some weight stats queries that will filter out all the weights that you don't care about. He keeps those maintained pretty well. Jonathan is the go-to guy for anything you need to do with extended events. He's got all kinds of scripts that will just walk you through just about anything.
Or if you are a developer or you're working on a query and you're trying to performance tune it, there is this website that Richie Rump, a friend of mine down in Miami, in the Miami area, wrote. It's called statisticsparser.com. If you go to that site and you just paste the output of statistics.io in it, it'll actually create a table of I/O usage per table. And it's really fantastic. I used it a lot.
You know what else, Argenis? If you run your query in Plan Explorer, we'll give you the table I/O in a nice sortable grid already.
Well, this is true, but yeah.
And you don't even have to set the statistics I/O on. We do it all for you.
I gotta admit, you guys have a killer product in Plan Explorer. You know, I'm very fortunate to be an MVP and have a free license for Plan Explorer Pro and have all the full set of features. I use it very frequently.
There are some other scripts out there too. So on Brent Ozar's site, there are scripts created by Brent and by Kendra and by Jeremiah. There's one, the SP Blitz and SP Blitz Index, and Kendra has some great videos and scripts about partitioning and about read committed snapshot isolation. So definitely some good things to check out over there too. BrentOzar.com.
Excellent. That is some great advice. That's going to give our listeners and viewers a lot of things to follow up on. Well, guys, we are about out of time. Any last closing thoughts, things you'd like to wrap up with?
I'd just like to say know SQL Server's defaults and know that in most cases you don't want them.
And I would like to wrap it up by saying love your SQL Server and it will love you back with performance.
Outstanding. All right, folks. Thank you so much for your time. We know you have a lot to do and that you made the choice to join us, carve out some time and spend it with us, and we appreciate that. Hope to see you on our next webcast and looking forward to hearing from you in social media, online, on our website, and so forth. Thanks again.
All right. Well, I hope that was fun and informative for you. For more information, be sure to check out our performance tuning and optimization blog. It's all about how to make SQL Server perform better. That's SQLperformance.com, and it's something that Aaron is keeping up with every day. We also have free query tuning consultations. You can go to answers.sqlperformance.com, and you can provide us with your various execution plans, and we will provide you with some help in order to make them perform better. If you haven't seen the source video that these different horror stories episodes are based on, take a look at it at SQL Century TV. There's the full URL there, but there's lots of other great videos on SQLcentury.tv, so we encourage you to look at all of those. And of course, you can reach Aaron and myself at our email addresses. You can go to our web pages on SQLcentury.com. And of course, we'd love to get in touch with you on social media, so we hope that you'll follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and LinkedIn. So with that, thank you, and hope to see you on our next edition.